April 7th, 2020 is a day which will forever live in infamy in my memory. It all began inconspicuously enough in early April. After taking a solitary stroll one afternoon, I developed a sore throat, joint pain in my knees, and weakness in my upper body. Initially, I brushed off the symptoms as allergy related. On Good Friday, the breathing trouble escalated drastically to the point where I felt like I was suffocating. My lungs seemed to be ballooning like airbags and then collapsing under the pressure. The heaviness in my lower chest made me feel like my alveolar sacs had been replaced with bags of marbles. I felt as though a giant block of ice had filled the space in my pleural cavity where my lungs used to be. Saturday was accompanied by the onset of fever and profuse perspiration from my forehead, neck, and back. By Sunday afternoon, the breathing had turned to wheezing, and the unrelenting, excruciating chest pain became unbearable. Tears streamed down my face as my breathing continued to shallow. I could feel the air exchange in my lungs becoming more inefficient with each passing breath, and I seemed to be spiraling into acute respiratory distress. For so many long haulers like myself, the BC era refers to the time before COVID, a simpler time. When the Black Death first ravaged Italy, it spread quickly, but cities soon developed countermeasures and came up with the idea of quarantine. The word originally comes from the medieval Italian word for 40, quaranta, because this period of isolation was 40 days. Unfortunately for me, my battle with COVID was not a short one. Over 10 quaranta would pass before I regained the slightest sense of normalcy. On the night of Monday, April 20th, 2020, COVID-19 dealt me another swift, hard blow and reeled me back into cowering submission. I once again began experiencing a crushing heaviness in my lungs, severe chest pain, nausea, loss of motor control. Within seconds, everything started to go black, and I felt as though I was about to breathe my last. It was like being choked and suffocated at the same time. With each successive cycle, COVID-19 seemed to reemerge with even greater determination to take me. It was like being knocked to the ground and strangled by an invisible stranger. I spent the remainder of my days barely breathing. The disease was like huge overlapping waves pushing up against a dam that I was constantly trying to fortify, always threatening to overwhelm my defenses and destroy all of cellular civilization at any given moment. In accordance with its protean nature, around the 5-week mark, COVID-19 began morphing from a primarily pulmonary disease into a neuropsychiatric one as well. Over the months that followed, I had many complications, including lung scarring, dysautonomia, tachycardia, kidney swelling, and GI inflammation. COVID also caused a horrible depression, the depths of which are hard to describe. Oftentimes, I felt as though I was already buried 6 feet under. While in the midst of my own seemingly never-ending battle with COVID, reports began to emerge of a long-tail form of the disease, first described by Paul Garner in the British Medical Journal through his own first-hand accounts. A month later, science journalist Ed Yong covered the plight of us long haulers in a piece written for The Atlantic. Quote, Garner's descriptions of his illness are similar to those of many long haulers who have been taken less seriously. If you took his words, put my name on them, and put them up on Medium, people would say, ugh, who is this person, and what is she talking about? End quote. The route of exposure remained a bit of a mystery. I had been isolating for well over a month when the pneumonia first set in. I hadn't had any direct contact with healthcare workers, grocery store clerks, or delivery truck drivers. When I heard New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announce on May 6 that 66% of new hospital admissions in his state were people who had been sheltering at home, I started to think that my situation wasn't all that unique. The fireworks sounded like bombs going off outside the large white isolation tent on the eve of July 4th. I had just been triaged and was waiting to see the attending doctor. About 15 minutes later, a male Indian nurse pulled back the curtain to swab me for SARS-CoV-2. It was the 4th time I had been subjected to the procedure. After another 20 minutes, the curtain was pulled back once again, and a young blonde doctor entered. She remarked that I didn't look like I was feeling well. Indeed, I struggled to breathe the entire ride over. She asked me what was going on, and I began to explain my sordid symptoms. In the pandemic, the divide between the infected and unaffected looms large. Some battle for their lives in intensive care units, while others go about their business as usual, almost impervious to the external threat lurking behind every corner, looking to claim or at least maim its next victim. For those afflicted with the long haul, life looks very different. Will we ever walk without vertigo again? Will our hearts ever beat normally again? Will the brain fog ever clear? I personally began isolating long before such recommendations became commonplace, and nonetheless ended up horribly ill, while so many contemporaries seemed to defy social distancing guidelines, downplay the risks, laugh in the face of danger, and still get off scotch-free. It all seemed out of proportion. Nothing made sense, not that it ever did. If Shakespeare, whoever he was, ever decided to tell my life story, he probably would have written it as a tragedy, with a heaping teaspoon of humor thrown in for good measure. Throughout my illness, I struggled with neuropsychiatric symptoms like hallucinations, depression, and delirium, though I dared not admit to those extrapulmonary manifestations. In my experience, doing so served as grounds for further physical and psychological abuse, but that's a story for another time. Throughout my struggle, the burden of my pre-existing conditions compounded the pain of my illness. As a young minority female, navigating healthcare had always been tricky. When I experienced any kind of weight loss, I was presumed to have an eating disorder, which invariably delayed my diagnosis of pancreatic insufficiency. When I exhibited trouble breathing or rapid heart rate, my distress was dismissed as anxiety. When I had an atonic seizure, I was accused of faking it. We often speak of our hearts hurting in metaphorical terms, but the myocardial damage from overuse adds another cruel, ironic layer of injury to our pain, like pouring salt and battery acid into an open wound, like a trauma that won't heal, like a scar that never solidifies or shrinks. Each time, the length of time to wear the heart monitor increased, first a week, then 14 days, then an entire month. The cardiac monitor always smelled as if it had been doused in a liter of pungent perfume, and no amount of rubbing alcohol or hydrogen peroxide could mask the scent. At times, the tachycardia caused a racing pulse of up to 200 beats per minute at rest. At other times, my pulse remained in the low 40s for several weeks. I was too weak to speak and could barely move. I would go to bed, expecting to fall asleep and simply not wake up. I'd never been so certain of death, and I told myself that it was all right, that I had no regrets. I was so sure that I didn't even cry. Truthfully, I had lost my will to live. The end seemed more like a welcome reprieve. If I wasn't able to find healing, maybe I could at least receive some peace. Upon waking up in the morning, I distinctly recall the utter disappointment at having to face another day in such excruciating pain. Breathing distress became my constant companion. My chest ached incessantly, and the burning chronic cystitis pain that I had come to know so well the past several years wouldn't let me sleep more than an hour at a time. I was so weak that I went weeks without showering. The violent vomiting and chills began anew anytime I tried to reintroduce solids. During these episodes, even the weight of my clothes was too much to bear and made my abdominal pain even more excruciating. The more I ate, the more I lost weight. I spent over 60 days in a state of metabolic acidosis, while my hair fell out in clumps. For me, COVID-19 was not a Netflix and chill type of illness. It was the type of illness that brought me to my knees, left me in tears, and broke my spirit. It was the type of illness that had me contemplating the end and thinking of all the people I wouldn't have a chance to say goodbye to. It was the type of illness that left me wondering which breath would be my last. People often point to my story as a cautionary tale about what can happen if the threat of COVID isn't taken seriously. But I take issue with this characterization as someone who had been isolating long before the pandemic began. Too often, our stories are politicized and stripped bare of their humanity, strewn upon the altar of public health warnings and advisories. But behind every story is a human being, with hopes and dreams and fears. Behind every story is someone just like us. Maybe misery really does love company, or maybe it's in the sharing of these stories that we find our common humanity. Maybe through overcoming adversity, we also overcome the distance between us and bridge superficial class divides. After all, no one is immune to the throes of misfortune. Perhaps that underlies the sentiment that Carl Sagan was trying to convey in Pale Blue Dot, that we all have a responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and preserve and cherish the only home we've ever known. That starts with creating a society that's inclusive and embraces disability and chronic illness such as long COVID. Until the unaffected are just as enraged as the afflicted, inequality will remain the order of the day.